The internet is often lacking in nuance, and there's no exception to that in conversations around canine aggression. One of the places that I see this most often is when there's a story that goes viral or attracts a lot of media attention, usually, unfortunately, because the aggression has left someone seriously injured or perhaps no longer alive. And you'll often see comments in the comment section, people talking about this in such a way that comes from a kernel of truth, but is being applied to the situation incorrectly. So you may see people talking about, for example, they may say things like, well, dogs don't bite for no reason. So what did the person do to provoke this response? Or you might see people talking about, in a similar vein, it's all how they're raised. So what did this person do? They may talk about how, dogs only bite when provoked. They always have a reason. And so, this dog deserves to be readopted out, to be rehabilitated, to be sent to another family. And so while there's, a kernel of truth in some of these statements, for example, dogs generally do have a reason for biting. Those kernels are then being surrounded by things that are perhaps misinformation or information that's being misapplied, and then being used to reach conclusions that are just dramatically off base. So I was thinking about that and wanted to make a video talking about the variables that we consider when assessing risk in aggression cases. And then that risk assessment can be used to decide whatever it is that we're trying to decide, whether that is if an animal is who is currently like in the shelter or in a rescue is safe to adopt out to the public, or whether an animal in a particular situation in their home is. So I wanted to make a video talking a bit about the factors that we consider when determining the level of risk associated with a dog's aggressive behavior. I want to talk about the nuance of these types of situations because not all bites are the same. So one of the factors that we consider when looking at an aggression case is the predictability of the bites. Or let's just say the predictability of the aggressive behavior. So it is true that dogs have a reason for biting when they bite. It is something that makes sense to them. That does not necessarily mean that it's something that makes sense to us or that it's something that is predictable for us. Now, in the vast majority of dog bite cases, we are able to identify a trigger. We being behavior professionals, pet parents may have a much harder time. And that's totally fair and why it can be helpful to work with a professional. But many times when folks come to me and say the bite just seemed to happen out of nowhere, I'm able to help them go back and look at the situation and say, I know that this doesn't feel like it makes sense, but it actually does, and I can help explain why. And sometimes we have to gather more information. Sometimes we need to do some deeper investigation. Pain is often a factor, but we can usually figure out what triggered the bite. That's not the same thing, though, as being able to predict when the aggression might happen. So for example, if I have a dog who resource guards and becomes aggressive while resource guarding, but they may, for example, resource guard their own vomit, or they may resource guard items that they find on the floor. And this could be something like a paper clip. That the human might not even know is there. Even if we're able to identify this pattern, it may be very difficult or even impossible for us to predict when that is going to happen with certainty. We may be able to narrow it down. This is more likely to happen at night. This is more likely to happen when they're experiencing a bad pain day. This is more likely to happen in this space in the house. But this is an example of how sometimes just because we know the trigger, it doesn't necessarily make the behavior easier to predict. And so predictability is its own factor that we consider. We also want to consider how easy the behavior is to manage, and this is linked to predictability. And so if I have a dog who displays aggressive behavior around their food bowl, that might be easier to manage than a dog who displays aggressive behavior anytime they hear a noise outside of the house. It may be very, very challenging to fully manage noises outside of the house. It may be much easier to manage something like presentation and access to the food bowl. Another factor that we consider is the bite level, and we have a couple of different bite scales to sort of look at the level of inhibition that the dog is using in that incident. Bite scales are not perfect, and the human bite scales are different than the dog scale that we should be using for dog-to-dog bites. And so while bite scales are not perfect, they can give us a lot of information. And this plays a big role in the level of risk. There is a big difference between a dog who is biting in an inhibited way, which could include an air snap. It could include contact without punctures. It could include contact with punctures that don't go deeper than half the length of the canine tooth. Those are what we consider inhibited bites. From there, we may see with those level 3 bites where we are seeing punctures, but they're not greater than half the length of the canine tooth, we may see things like multiple bites within a single episode. That's going to be higher level and due to higher arousal than a single level 3 bite where the dog then moves away. And then there's level 4 and 5 and 6, and the difference between 5 and 6 is whether or not the victim survives the bite. And so going back to the example of stories that tend to get a lot of attention, we're often talking about very high level bites. And so one of the lacks of nuance that you'll often see in these conversations is a lot of people will be talking about the bites or the attack as if these are inhibited bites, when we have often gone past that. If it's such a situation where the story is being picked up by the media and we are looking at uninhibited bites, a much higher level of risk. Another consideration in these types of situations is the distance that the dog closed when they aggressed against the person. And so even at a lower level of bite, there's a difference between a dog who bit when someone stuck their hand in his face and a dog who ran 50 yards closer to the person to bite them. And both of those dogs could, let's say, have the stranger danger. Both of those dogs could be motivated by fear. But when you have a dog who will close a bigger gap, that becomes more difficult to manage and it becomes a less safe situation. The risk is higher. And so that's something that we consider in aggression cases. Another factor, and this is related to arousal levels, is the dog's continued engagement. So if the dog is separated, if they are put back on the other side of a room, if they are put behind a fence, if they are put into a car, if they are separated from the person or the dog, whatever the case may be, against who they were aggressing. Do they go out of that situation and stay back, or do they try to re-engage? Are they trying to re-engage from this separated place? That is a good piece of information in terms of arousal, in terms of inhibition, in terms of risk. And so you can see that there's a very big difference between the risk in a case where you have lots of warning signs, where you have clear predictability, a low number of triggers, you have a low frequency of incidents, you have a low level bite, you have a small gap that the dog is willing to close. That can be very different than a dog who engages in a very high level bite or has difficult triggers that are difficult to predict, difficult to manage, or who has a higher frequency of bites in their history, or who will close a bigger gap, or who will continue to try and re-engage. And this type of nuance often doesn't make it to the conversations we have around dog bites on the internet.